The dust of New Mexico was a living thing. It was the color of rust and old blood, and it rose from the baked earth in fine, choking clouds with every lurch of the stagecoach. Eliza Hart pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, the linen already gritty and smelling of the dry, hot wind. From her window, the world was a study in harshness. The sun hammered down from a sky so vast and pale it seemed to mock the very idea of shelter. In the distance, the Organ Mountains stood like a jagged purple bruise against the horizon, remote and unforgiving. This was San Perdido, or what passed for it. A scattering of adobe and weathered wood buildings huddled together as if for protection against the sheer emptiness that surrounded them. She had come here to disappear, but also to begin again. The scandal that had driven her from Boston felt like a lifetime ago, a hothouse drama of whispers and accusations that had no place under this fierce, honest sun. A schoolteacher. They had called her. A temptress who had led the son of the town's most prominent family astray. The words were lies. A convenient shield for a weak boy and his powerful father. But mud once thrown has a way of sticking. So she had packed her few belongings, her books, and the small Colt revolver her own father had insisted she learn to use, and bought a ticket for the furthest place she could find on a map, a place where a name was something you earned, not something you inherited or had stripped from you by gossip. The town grew closer, resolving into a single dusty street dominated by a two-story saloon with a sign that read, "The Mesquite Star." A raw timber chapel stood opposite, its cross tilted slightly as if in prayer or exhaustion. There was a general store, a blacksmith, and the faint rhythmic clang of hammers on steel that hinted at the railroad, the great artery of progress, inching its way across the territory. Hope, fragile as a desert flower, stirred in Eliza's chest. Here, she would be judged by her actions. Here, she would build a life. The crack of a rifle shattered the air. The coach jerked violently, throwing Eliza against the opposite seat. The driver shouted something lost to the wind and the thunder of hooves. Another shot splintered the wood near her window. Men on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas, were closing in, yelling and firing into the air. They were not trying to kill, she realized with a cold knot of fear in her stomach. They were trying to terrify, to drive the coach off, to send a message to any newcomer that San Perdido did not welcome strangers. The driver lost control. The stage careened, wheels screaming, and tilted precariously toward a deep arroyo. This is how it ends, she thought. Not in a Boston parlor, but in a cloud of red dust. Then, another rider appeared, seemingly from nowhere. He moved with a liquid grace that was part of his horse, a blur of motion against the static landscape. He was not one of the ambushers. He rode low and fast, his face set in a grim line, and the pistol in his hand was not for making noise. He fired twice, not at the men, but at the lead horse of the nearest attacker. The animal screamed and went down in a tangle of leather and limbs. The rider behind it was thrown clear, cursing as he hit the ground. The others faltered, their sport turning suddenly serious. The lone rider did not slow. He swept past the coach, his eyes briefly meeting Eliza's. They were gray, clear and calm as a winter sky, and in them she saw not panic, but purpose. He wheeled his horse and placed himself between the coach and the remaining men. He did not speak a word. He simply sat there, a silent challenge. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Their fun was spoiled. After a moment of tense standoff, they turned their horses and galloped away, their whoops and hollers fading into the immense silence of the desert. The world settled back into heat and dust. The stage driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, was trying to calm his spooked team. The lone rider dismounted and walked toward the coach. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who wasted no motion. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and leather, a layer of dust coating him like a second skin. Up close, his silence was even more profound. He addressed the driver, his voice low and steady. "The axle is cracked. You will not make it to town." He then turned his attention to Eliza, who had climbed out of the coach on shaky legs. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze direct but not unkind, "there is an old grain barn a mile from here. It will be safer than waiting on the road." Eliza nodded, unable to find her voice. She had faced down the scorn of an entire town, yet the raw violence of this encounter had stolen her breath. The man's name, she would later learn, was Jonah Pike. He was a cattleman, a man who had once worn the blue of the cavalry, and he valued his words like gold, spending them only when necessary. He helped the driver unhitch 2 of the horses and fashioned a makeshift harness to pull the damaged coach slowly forward. He offered his own horse to Eliza. She hesitated for only a second before accepting, gathering her skirts and mounting the animal. It was a powerful beast, yet it stood perfectly still for her, sensing the calm authority of its master. Jonah walked alongside, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They reached the barn as the sun began to bleed across the western sky. It was a derelict structure, its wood bleached gray by the sun, but its roof was mostly intact, and it offered a defense against the vast, exposed land. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old hay, and dust motes danced in the slanted bars of evening light. As her eyes adjusted, she saw they were not alone. A small family of native people, perhaps Mescalero Apache, were huddled in the far corner. A woman, a man with a weathered face, and 2 children. The woman was weeping softly, cradling the arm of the younger child, a boy no older than 7. Jonah spoke to the man in a quiet mix of Spanish and a language Eliza did not recognize. The man replied in kind, his gestures sharp with anxiety. Jonah turned back to her. The boy was grazed. From the ambush, they were caught in the middle of it. Eliza moved forward without a second thought. Her medical knowledge was basic, gleaned from books and tending to her father through his final illness, but it was better than nothing. She knelt by the child, her voice soft. "May I see?" she asked the mother, using the simple, clear Spanish she had practiced for the journey. The woman looked from Eliza's face to Jonah's. He gave a slight nod. The woman hesitantly pulled back the cloth she was using to press against the wound. It was a long, shallow gash along the boy's forearm, bleeding sluggishly but not deeply. It was the sort of wound that, left to the dirt and heat, could easily fester and turn deadly. Eliza opened her travel trunk. She had clean linen, a bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning, and a small tin of salve. She worked gently, cleaning the wound with diluted acid, ignoring the boy's sharp intake of breath. She explained each step in her calm Spanish, telling him he was very brave. She spread the salve over the wound and bound it tightly with a strip of clean linen torn from a petticoat. When she was finished, she looked at the mother and smiled. "He will be fine. Just keep it clean." The mother stared at her, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. She whispered a word of thanks. The boy, his fear subsiding, managed a small, shy smile. Jonah Pike watched the entire exchange from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had seen a woman of letters, a finely dressed lady from the East, get on her knees in a dusty barn to tend to a native child without a moment's hesitation. He had seen her hands, steady and sure. He filed the observation away, another rare and valuable thing in a land of harsh realities. By the time Eliza Hart finally arrived in the heart of San Perdido the next morning, her story had arrived before her. News in a place this small traveled on the wind. She was the new schoolteacher who had faced down Crow's thugs. She was the woman who had saved the life of a native child. She was an object of immediate and intense curiosity. The town's women gathered near the church after morning prayers, assessed her as she walked toward the boarding house. They saw her fine but travel-worn dress, the determined set of her jaw, and the way she met their stares without flinching. Their whispers followed her like the dust her boots kicked up. The name Hart meant nothing to them, but the whispers that had followed her from Boston had found their own way west, passed along in letters between sisters and cousins, mutating with each telling. A woman alone, a woman with a past. Her act of kindness in the barn was weighed against these darker rumors. For some, it was a sign of a good heart. For others, it was merely the clever act of a woman who knew how to win favor. From the shaded porch of the Mesquite Star, Silas Crow watched her too. He was a thick, powerful man, his face weathered not by honest sun but by a constant, simmering avarice. His empire was built on cattle and salt, but its foundation was water. He controlled nearly every well and spring for 50 miles, except for one, the Arroyo de Vida, the Creek of Life, and the old well that sat beneath the abandoned schoolhouse. He had heard about the ambush. His men were clumsy fools, but they served their purpose. He had also heard about the new schoolteacher. He noted the way she carried herself, the intelligence in her eyes. But what interested him most was the report from one of his Spanish-speaking men. She spoke to the natives. She could read. In Silas Crow's world, a person who could read paper was a person who could read a contract, a deed, a map. A person who could speak to the natives was a person who could hear their stories, their claims to the land and the water that he believed was his for the taking. This schoolteacher was not just a woman with a questionable past. She was a potential complication, a threat to be watched, and if necessary, to be broken. Eliza felt his eyes on her, a heavy, possessive gaze that made the skin on her neck prickle. She looked toward him, her expression a cool mask of indifference, and then continued on her way. She had come to San Perdido seeking refuge from prejudice, a place to build a new name. She saw now, with a sinking feeling, that she had only traded one kind of cage for another. The bars here were not made of whispers and lies, but of sun-baked earth, thirst, and the cold, hard ambition of men like Silas Crow. The question was not if she could survive, but how she would find the strength to fight in a world determined to see her fail. The dust settled on the street, and in the quiet that followed, a battle for a woman's name, and for the soul of a town, had just begun. The grain barn became Eliza's school. It was a place of defiant learning, where the scent of spelling primers mingled with the dry perfume of ancient hay. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the weathered planks, painting shifting lines of gold across the dirt floor. Her students were a motley collection of San Perdido's forgotten children, sons and daughters of homesteaders, their faces already etched with the sun and wind. A few quiet, watchful children from the native families who lived on the edge of town, their presence a silent testament to the trust she had earned. They sat on upturned crates and stacks of old feed sacks, their slates balanced on their knees. Payment came in the form of barter, a dozen fresh eggs for a lesson on long division, a slab of cornbread for a freshly filled inkwell, a string of dried jerky for a story read aloud from her worn copy of Hawthorne. It was a fragile economy of knowledge and survival, and it was hers. She taught them their letters, how to add and subtract, how to write their own names with a proud, careful hand. She was building something from nothing. And in the small, focused faces of her pupils, she saw the foundation of her new life. Jonah Pike became a quiet, recurring presence. He never announced his arrival. One afternoon, she would look up to see his silhouette against the bright square of the doorway. A length of fresh timber balanced on his shoulder. He would spend an hour patching the leaky section of the roof, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a steady counterpoint to the drone of recitation inside. He never asked for thanks and rarely spoke more than a handful of words, but his actions were a language she was beginning to understand. Every few days, he would arrive with 2 heavy barrels of water on a small cart, water he hauled from his own small ranch miles away. He would fill her drinking bucket and water the scrawny, hopeful plants she was trying to coax from the earth in a small garden patch behind the barn. He was a silent guardian, a man who saw a need and met it without fanfare. His presence was a comfort, a solid and dependable thing in a world that felt precarious. While Eliza built her school, Silas Crow was moving to secure his kingdom. He made his play for the old, abandoned schoolhouse in a public town council meeting. The building was a wreck, its windows shattered, its porch sagging like a tired old man. Crow stood before the council, a group of merchants and ranchers who owed him their prosperity, and presented his offer as an act of civic generosity. He would buy the derelict property, tear it down, and build a new, secure warehouse for the salt from his mines. It would bring business, he argued, a sign of San Perdido's growth and stability. His true target lay hidden beneath the rotting floorboards. The old town well, long forgotten by most, was still there. It was a deep, reliable well that tapped directly into the underground flow of the Arroyo de Vida. In a land ruled by thirst, owning that well was like owning a mint. It was the final link in the chain of his monopoly on water, the one resource no man, woman, or child could live without. The council, eager to curry favor with their patron, praised his foresight and community spirit. They agreed to sell him the property for a pittance. The deal was all but done. Eliza learned of the sale from the wife of the general store owner, a woman whose gossip was as reliable as the sunrise. A cold dread settled in her stomach. It was not just about a building. It was about what the building represented. A place of learning being replaced by a monument to Crow's greed. On a hunch, driven by a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. She went to the small, dusty room in the back of the marshal's office that served as the town's hall of records. She spent hours poring over brittle, yellowed documents. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. She was looking for anything, any loophole or forgotten covenant, and then she found it. The original deed for the schoolhouse property, granted by the territorial government in 1852. The language was dense, a thicket of legal terms. But one clause snagged her attention. The land and all its appurtenances, it read, were granted for the purpose of education in perpetuity. The property would revert to the township only in the event that the original grantee, a Mr. Samuel Hart, and all of his direct heirs were deceased or their whereabouts unknown for a period of no less than 20 years. Hart. The name was a jolt, a familiar echo in a strange place. It was her own surname. A coincidence, surely, yet the detail was enough. The town council, and by extension Silas Crow, could not sell what they did not legally own if an heir to Samuel Hart could be found. The clerk, a wispy man with ink-stained fingers, told her that Samuel Hart had vanished during an Apache raid more than 15 years ago, presumed dead. He had a wife and a child, but they had left the territory shortly after. No one knew where they went. But, the clerk added, if anyone in San Perdido remembered the old families, it would be the widow Ortega. She lived alone in a small adobe house several miles out in the scrubland, a living relic of the town's earliest days. Eliza knew she had to speak with her. The drought held the land in its grip. The sun was a merciless tyrant, baking the moisture from the air and the hope from people's hearts. The level of the public well dropped lower each day, and tensions in town grew with every empty bucket. The ride to the Ortega homestead was not something she could do alone. As she stood staring out at the shimmering heat rising from the desert, wondering who she could possibly ask for help, Jonah Pike rode up beside her. He seemed to have a sixth sense for her troubles. I hear you are going to see the Ortega widow, he said, his voice as calm and dry as the air itself. It is not a safe ride for one. His offer was not a question, but a statement of fact. She found herself nodding, a wave of relief washing over her. An hour later, they were riding out of town, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. Mrs. Ortega was as tough and weathered as the landscape she inhabited. Her face was a beautiful ruin, her eyes dark and sharp, missing nothing. She was suspicious at first, her answers to Eliza's questions curt and clipped, but she saw the quiet respect in Jonah's demeanor, and she saw the desperate sincerity in Eliza's face. She listened as Eliza explained the clause in the deed. Her interest piqued. The name Hart, she said, tasting the word. Yes, she remembered Samuel, a good man, an educated man from the East, like you. He wanted to build a real school. As they prepared to ride back to San Perdido, the world began to change. The brilliant blue of the sky deepened to a bruised, sickly yellow at the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, suddenly died, leaving an eerie, oppressive stillness. Then it returned with a vengeance, a low moan that grew into a terrifying roar. A vast, churning wall of red dust, a monster that blotted out the sun, was rolling toward them across the plain, a haboob. There was no outrunning it. Jonah's voice cut through the rising wind. "This way." He spurred his horse toward a small outcropping of rocks, a meager shelter against the coming storm. They dismounted just as the dust wall hit, plunging the world into a roaring, suffocating twilight. The wind screamed, tearing at their clothes, and the air was thick with stinging, blinding sand. It was like being swallowed whole. "Mrs." Ortega huddled against the rocks, praying in a rapid stream of Spanish. Eliza pressed herself into a crevice, her handkerchief held over her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was nature in its most elemental and terrifying form, a force that could scour a human being from the face of the earth, in the midst of the chaos. Jonah moved with his characteristic calm. He pulled Eliza from her small shelter and maneuvered her onto his horse, seating her in front of him, his body a solid shield against the storm's fury. He wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her secure. The noise was deafening, the darkness absolute. She could feel the vibration of the wind through his body, the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her back. He leaned down, his mouth close to her ear, his voice a low rumble against the howl of the storm. Trying to make her voice heard above the gale, she shouted, "Can you always find your way in this blinding dust?" She felt the slight shake of his head against her hair. "No," he yelled back, his breath warm against her ear. "But I know how to hold tight to what needs keeping safe." His words, simple and direct, landed in the center of her fear and bloomed into something warm and steadying. In that moment, surrounded by a terrifying natural violence, she felt safer than she had in years. He was not just protecting her from the storm. He was seeing her, the woman who was fighting for a foothold in this harsh land, and he was telling her, in his own quiet way, that she was worth protecting. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world remade. The landscape was muted, softened by a fresh blanket of red dust. The air was still and cool. They were all alive, shaken and covered in grit, but unharmed. They rode the rest of the way to town in a shared, contemplative silence. When they reached her boarding house, "Mrs." Ortega pressed a small, dented tin box into Eliza's hands. "My husband was a friend of Samuel Hart," she said, her dark eyes looking directly into Eliza's. "He kept these for him. Perhaps you will find what you are looking for." Eliza took the box, its weight feeling heavy with significance. That night, by the flickering light of a single candle, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, were a handful of faded letters, a small, leather-bound Bible, and a sheaf of official-looking papers tied with a faded ribbon. As she carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the topmost document, her breath caught in her throat. It was a marriage certificate, dated 1851. The names on the certificate were Samuel Hart and Mary Ortega, her father's estranged older brother. Samuel Hart was her uncle, and that meant the school, and the water that flowed beneath it belonged to her. The weight of the tin box on her lap was the weight of a past she never knew she had. Eliza spent the night with the documents spread across the small table in her room, the candlelight flickering over the elegant, faded script of her uncle's letters and the stark, official language of the legal papers. It was a ghost story told in ink and paper, a tale of a man who had come west with the same hopeful heart as her own, only to be swallowed by the vast, violent landscape. He was family. The knowledge settled deep in her bones, a surprising and solid anchor. This was no longer just a fight for a school. It was a fight for her inheritance. Her first stop the next morning was the small timber chapel. Reverend Michael, a kind man with gentle eyes and a perpetually worried brow, examined the marriage certificate and the Bible with its inscribed family tree. He confirmed the names and dates aligned with the old church records. His blessing, however, was tinged with fear. "Be careful, my child," he whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he returned the papers. "Silas Crow's shadow is long and dark in this town. He does not like to be challenged." His caution led her not to the marshal, a gruff, portly man known to spend more time in the Mesquite Star than in his office, but to his deputy. Deputy May Collins was a woman who stood out in San Perdido, and not just for the color of her skin. She carried herself with a ramrod straight posture that spoke of discipline and an unshakable core of self-possession. A widow, she had come to the territory after serving as a nurse in the war, and her gaze held the weary wisdom of someone who had seen the worst of men and was not easily intimidated. Eliza found her sharpening a set of pencils at her small, orderly desk. The office smelled of sawdust, old paper, and strong coffee. May listened without interruption as Eliza laid out her story, her dark eyes moving from Eliza's face to the documents spread on the desk. She handled the fragile papers with a nurse's careful touch, her expression betraying nothing. "This is a clear title of inheritance," May said finally, her voice a low, steady alto. "The marriage certificate to an Ortega connects your uncle to this land. The family Bible and his letters confirm his identity. And this," she tapped the original land deed, "this is the lock. The property was never legally the town's to sell." A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Eliza. "It is real. Then I have a right." "You have a right," May affirmed, meeting her gaze. "But a right on paper and a right respected in San Perdido are two different things. Crow owns the town committee. They will not simply roll over." "What do I do?" Eliza asked. "You file a formal claim. You present these documents. You force their hand into the light, and you do not do it alone." May's eyes held a flicker of something new, a shared understanding. In her, Eliza saw not just an officer of the law, but an ally. The town committee meeting was a public spectacle, staged on the porch of the general store. Silas Crow stood at the back, arms crossed over his chest, a silent, menacing god observing the machinations of his mortal puppets. The chairman, a pompous hardware merchant named Bartholomew, read Eliza's claim aloud, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "She claims," he announced to the assembled crowd, "that this long-lost uncle no one has seen in 15 years makes her the rightful owner of the old school. She expects us to halt the progress of this town, to halt the construction of a new warehouse that will bring prosperity to us all, on the basis of these convenient papers." Another councilman, a rancher whose land bordered crows, chimed in. "And how did she come by these papers? By spending time alone with the old Ortega widow, and who escorted her Jonah Pike?" He let the name hang in the air. "It seems our new school teacher is skilled in more than just her letters. She knows how to use her charms to get what she wants." The insinuation was as thick and foul as mud. A few of the women from the church tittered, their earlier suspicions now given a voice of authority. Eliza's face burned, but she stood her ground, her chin held high. She saw Jonah on the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of stone, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "This is a legal matter," Eliza said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. "It is about what is written in the law, not in your imaginations. My claim is valid. The town has no right to sell my family's property." Bartholomew laughed. "Your family," he scoffed. "You are a newcomer, a woman of questionable reputation who arrives with a fantastic story. We will take this under advisement." The dismissal was absolute. The crowd began to disperse. The matter settled in their minds. Crow had won. Jonah waited for her as she walked away, the sting of public humiliation sharp in her throat. He fell into step beside her, his presence a silent comfort. "Do not listen to them," he said, his voice a low growl. "Their words are just wind rattling a loose shutter." "It is not the words I am afraid of," Eliza confessed. "It is the man who pays for them." Later that day, a small boy delivered a note to her. It was from Mrs. Ortega, requesting she visit. When Eliza arrived at the small adobe house, the old woman was waiting, a fresh letter in her hand. This one was not in the tin box, she explained. I kept it separate. It is more personal. The letter was from Samuel Hart, written to his wife's sister, Mrs. Ortega's mother. It spoke of his love for his family, his dreams for the school, and in the final paragraph, he mentioned his only living relative back east, his younger brother, Thomas Hart. My brother Thomas has a new daughter. He wrote, Eliza, should anything happen to me and my own child not survive, I have made arrangements that my property here should pass to his line. It is my wish that a heart always stands for education in this wild place. It was the final, unbreakable link, the key that turned the lock May had spoken of. Eliza was not just a descendant, she was the named heir. The sun was setting as she walked back to her barn, the precious letter clutched in her hand. The students had gone home for the day. A sense of weary triumph filled her. She had the proof. Crow could not deny it. As she neared the clearing, she saw Jonah patiently mending a section of the split-rail fence. He looked up and gave her a small, questioning nod. She smiled, a real, radiant smile, and held up the letter. The world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the twilight air, a flash of orange and black against the purple sky. The ground bucked beneath her feet. She looked in horror as the back half of the barn's roof erupted upwards, disintegrating into a rain of splintered timber and dust. Dynamite! Jonah was already moving. He sprinted toward the collapsing structure, his face a mask of grim fury. Tomas, one of her brightest students, a 10-year-old boy who often stayed late to help clean the slates, had been inside. Jonah disappeared into the choking cloud of dust and debris. Eliza's heart stopped. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, he emerged from the settling dust, coughing, with the terrified but unharmed boy in his arms. He set the child down, pushing him toward Eliza. Get him away from here. He turned back toward the ruin but staggered, his hand flying to his left shoulder, through a tear in his shirt. Eliza saw blood, dark and slick in the dying light. A piece of flying timber had struck him. She rushed to his side, her brief moment of triumph incinerated by the brutal reality of Crow's response. Inside the remaining section of the barn, by the frantic light of a lantern, she saw the wound, a deep, jagged gash in the muscle of his shoulder, bleeding freely. We have to get a doctor, she said, her voice trembling. No time, Jonah grunted, his face pale with pain. Crow's men might be back. Just do what you can. Her medical kit was meager. There was no laudanum for the pain, no fine surgical tools. She took a bottle of whiskey from her own small store of supplies, a tin of carbolic salve, and the sewing kit she used for mending clothes. This will hurt, she warned, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. He just nodded, his jaw tight. She poured the raw alcohol into the wound. He stiffened, a sharp hiss of breath escaping through his teeth, but he made no other sound. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle. She was a teacher, a woman who dealt in books and ideas. But the sight of his blood, his pain, born of his courage in protecting her and her student, ignited a fierce, protective resolve within her. Her hands steadied. She worked carefully, pulling the edges of the torn flesh together, her stitches small and even. The barn was silent save for the frantic chirping of crickets outside and Jonah's ragged breathing. The lantern light cast their shadows, large and dancing, against the remaining wall. She was intensely aware of him, of the heat of his skin, the strength in the arm that now lay wounded and helpless. She finished the last stitch and tied it off, her movements economical and precise, like the man she was tending. She bandaged the wound tightly with strips of clean linen. He looked at her when she was done, his gray eyes dark with pain and something else, something deep and searching. He saw the smear of dust on her cheek, the fierce concentration in her eyes, the way her trembling had given way to a steely calm. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. She only nodded, her throat too tight for words. The ruined school stood around them, a testament to the violence they faced, but in that small circle of lantern light, A new pact was forged. Jonah reached out with his good hand and touched her arm, his fingers gently closing around her wrist. His gaze held hers, unwavering. "As long as I am breathing," he said, his voice low but filled with an absolute, unbreakable certainty. "Crow will not take a single drop of water from these children." It was not a declaration of love. It was something more primal, more profound. It was a promise of allegiance, a vow made in the face of shared battle. It was everything. The explosion that tore the roof from Eliza's school also ripped the thin veil of civility from San Perdido. The battle lines were no longer drawn in whispers and legal documents, but in the stark reality of violence. Yet Crow's brutality had an unintended consequence. It had transformed a private dispute into a public wound. The sight of the ruined barn, a place where their children had begun to learn, hardened the hearts of the homesteaders against him. They had little power, but they had memory, and they would not soon forget. The drought, however, was an enemy that could not be intimidated. It tightened its grip, relentless and cruel. The public well became a place of snarling desperation. And then they began to arrive. At first, it was just a trickle. A single family of migrants, their wagon a skeleton of sun-bleached wood, their faces gaunt with thirst. Then a small band of mescalero, driven from their lands by the dying streams. Soon, a steady stream of the dispossessed flowed into San Perdido, all of them drawn by the last rumor of public water. The town, already stretched to its limit, began to fray. Fights broke out daily at the well, men snarling over a few precious gallons of brackish water. The storekeeper raised his prices, and the faces of the townspeople grew pinched with a fear that was older than any feud. San Perdido was dying of thirst. Eliza, teaching her small class in the open air beside the wreckage of her school, could not ignore the suffering. She watched as a migrant mother gave her own meager water ration to her child, her own lips cracked and bleeding. That evening, Eliza took the small bag of coin she had carefully saved and went not to the storekeeper, but to the other merchants. She bought what little dried beans and corn they would sell. Then she went to Crow's salt warehouse. Salt was the one thing he had in abundance. She traded her last few dollars for a heavy sack. The next morning, she hung a large cast-iron pot over a fire near the ruined barn. She started a soup. It was a thin, meager broth, but it was hot and nourishing. She set up a plank table and laid out her slates. A sign, written in her clear, bold hand, announced the terms. A bowl of soup for a handful of dried vegetables, a strip of jerky, anything that could be spared to add to the pot for the next day. Another sign offered a different kind of trade, a bowl of soup for any child who could write their own name. The children were the first to come, the migrant children, the native children, her own students. They stood in a dusty line, their eyes wide with hunger, one by one. Eliza would hand them a piece of chalk and guide their small hands on the slate. Tomas, Maria, they would form the letters of their own identity, a small act of creation in a world of deprivation, and when they were done, she would ladle a full bowl of soup into their hands. It was more than a meal. It was a lesson in dignity. She was teaching them that their name, their very existence, had value. Slowly, the adults began to join in. The community, fractured by fear, found a new center around her simmering pot, Mrs. Ortega arrived one afternoon, her back straight, carrying a small basket of precious dried peppers from her garden. She sat with Eliza as the children practiced their letters, and she spoke of the old well beneath the schoolhouse. "That water is not just water," she said, her voice a low, rhythmic chant. "It is the memory of this place. Every person who dug that well, every woman who pulled a bucket from its depths to soothe a feverish child, every thirsty traveler who drank from it, they are all still there. The water remembers. To steal that water is to steal our history, our soul." Deputy May Collins became a regular visitor, always arriving with a contribution for the pot and a quiet word for Eliza. "I am looking into Crow's books," she said one evening, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "The records for his salt mine do not add up. He is paying men who do not seem to exist. He is buying supplies that never arrive. He is a liar on paper. Eliza, and a man who lies on paper will eventually be caught by it." May's methodical, patient investigation was a slow-burning fuse, moving steadily closer to Crow's powder keg of corruption. The discovery, when it came, was an accident. Young Thomas, the boy Jonah had saved from the explosion, was a creature of boundless curiosity. He was exploring the alley behind the Mesquite Star, a treasure trove of discarded bottles and other wonders, when he saw it. A thick, leather-bound ledger, half hidden beneath a loose floorboard of the saloon's back porch. It must have been dropped, forgotten in a moment of drunken carelessness by one of Crow's foremen. Thinking it was a book of stories, Thomas snatched it up and ran to Eliza. It was not a book of stories, but it told a damning tale. Page after page, in a cramped, precise hand, detailed every bribe, every inflated invoice, every secret land purchase Crow had made for the past 5 years. It was a map of his greed, a confession in black ink. Eliza's hands trembled as she held it. This was the weapon May needed. This was the truth. But before she could get the book to the deputy, the weather turned. The change was unnervingly sudden. The relentless, brassy sun vanished, replaced by a sky the color of a leaden bruise. The air grew still and heavy, and a strange, biting chill crept out of the north. Then the first snowflake fell, then another. Within an hour, a thick, silent blanket of white was covering the red dust. A freak early snowstorm had descended on the territory, a beautiful and terrifying anomaly. The snow fell for 2 days, burying San Perdido. The roads became impassable. The town was an island in a sea of white, cut off from the outside world. The cold was a new kind of misery. For Silas Crow, it was an opportunity. With the town isolated and the law's attention focused on survival, he could act with impunity. He could solve his problem with the schoolteacher and her well once and for all. His plan was simple and monstrous. He would poison the well, and in the ensuing panic and sickness, he would blame the outsider, the woman who had stirred up so much trouble. Jonah, his shoulder now mostly healed but still stiff, felt the shift in the town's atmosphere. His instincts, honed by years on the trail and in battle, told him that the storm had made their enemy bolder. He and Eliza began to keep watch over the ruined school at night, their shared purpose a silent warmth against the biting cold. On the third night of the storm, they saw them, 2 figures, moving like ghosts through the swirling snow, carrying heavy sacks. They moved directly to the stone-lined opening of the old well. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Jonah put a calming hand on her arm, his touch firm and steady. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking unnaturally loud in the muffled silence. They watched as one of the men pried the heavy wooden cover off the well. The other opened his sack and began to pour a fine, white powder into the dark opening. It was not salt. "Now," Jonah whispered. They moved together, emerging from the shadows of the ruined barn. Jonah's voice was like the crack of ice. "Step away from the well." The men spun around, their faces pale with shock in the moonlight filtering through the clouds. One of them dropped his sack, the white powder spilling onto the snow. He drew a pistol. Jonah did not hesitate. He fired, not at the man, but at the gun in his hand. The pistol clattered onto the stones. The other man, seeing his partner disarmed, turned and fled, disappearing into the blinding snow. The first man scrambled to follow, firing a wild shot over his shoulder as he ran. The bullet sang past Eliza's head. Jonah shoved her down behind the low stone wall of the well just as the man fired again. This time, Jonah grunted, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He staggered, clutching his side. "They are gone," he gasped, his face a pale mask in the darkness. Eliza saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, just above his belt. He had been hit. Again. For her. A cold, clear rage burned away her fear. This was not a legal fight anymore. It was a war. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring Jonah's pained protest. She ran to the wreckage of the school, grabbing the storm lantern she kept there. She lit the wick, the flame casting a brave, defiant circle of light in the swirling darkness. Then she found the rope for the old school bell, the one that had hung in the belfry before the explosion. The bell itself now lay on its side near the foundation, a heavy bronze casualty, but its sound was still true. She grabbed the rope with both hands and pulled. The heavy bell rolled slightly, and a single resonant note rang out, sharp and clear and urgent. She pulled again and again, the clang of the bell cutting through the howl of the wind, a frantic heartbeat in the frozen night. It was an alarm, a call to arms, a declaration that the people of San Perdido would not be terrorized in the darkness. Lights began to appear in the windows of the town. Doors creaked open. Figures emerged, holding their own lanterns, their faces etched with alarm and confusion. They saw the light of her lantern by the well. They heard the desperate, insistent summons of the bell, and for the first time since she had arrived, a lone woman with a tarnished name. The people of San Perdido began to walk toward her. They were no longer a scattered, fearful crowd. They were a community, drawn together by a common threat, and they were coming to her side. The bell's echo faded into the howl of the wind, but its summons had been answered. A collection of lanterns bobbed through the swirling snow, a small constellation of courage moving toward her. Deputy May Collins was in the lead, a shotgun held steady in her arms, her face a grim mask of determination. Behind her came the men from the town, their initial alarm hardening into anger as they saw the scene before them. They saw the spilled powder, a ghostly stain against the snow near the well. They saw the blood on Jonah, a dark flower blooming on his side. And they saw Eliza, standing like a sentinel, her face pale but her eyes blazing in the lantern light. There was no need for explanations. The story was written there in the snow and the blood. Silas Crow had finally overplayed his hand, crossing the line from intimidation to an act of war against the entire community. The men formed a protective circle, their own weapons now drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. May knelt beside Jonah, her nurse's training taking over. "It is a graze," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos, "but it is deep, and he is losing heat. We need to get him inside." The teacher's room, a small, lean-to structure at the back of the barn, had survived the explosion mostly intact. It was small and drafty, but it had 4 walls and a section of roof. It was a haven. A few of the stronger men carefully lifted Jonah, his face tight with pain, and carried him into the small room. Eliza followed, her mind a flurry of desperate calculations. She needed clean water, bandages, heat. Mrs. Ortega was already there, directing 2 other women. One was stoking a fire in the small pot-bellied stove, using splintered wood from the wreckage. Another was melting snow in a kettle. They worked with a quiet, efficient sympathy. Their earlier suspicions of Eliza burned away by the night's violence. They saw her not as an outsider, but as the woman who had stood her ground for them, the woman for whom Jonah Pike had bled twice. They laid him on the narrow cot, and Mrs. Ortega pressed a bundle of clean linen into Eliza's hands. "You do what is needed," she said, her dark eyes filled with a fierce, maternal light. "We will stand watch." Then they were gone, leaving Eliza and Jonah alone in the small, warm circle of candlelight. The storm outside raged, its fury a muffled roar that sealed them off from the rest of the world. The small room was an arc of quiet and warmth in a world of frozen chaos. Jonah was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook the small cot. His skin was pale and clammy, but when she touched his forehead, he was burning with fever. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as she had before. The bullet had torn a furrow along his ribs. It was not a fatal wound, but in this cold, with the fever setting in, it was dangerous. She stitched it closed, her hands moving with a desperate, focused calm. He was conscious, his gray eyes watching her, clouded with pain. She finished the bandage, but the shivering did not stop. The cold was deep in his bones. She piled the 2 thin blankets she owned on top of him, but they were not enough. He was a large man, and the chill had taken hold. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her composure. She needed more warmth, more layers, anything to fight the fever's cold fire. Her eyes darted around the small room. There was nothing. Then she looked down at herself. Beneath her practical wool dress, she wore a chemise, and beneath that, her corset. The corset itself was stiff and useless, but its lining was made of soft, thick cotton flannel, a final layer of warmth against the Boston winters she had left behind. It was a substantial piece of fabric. It could be warmed by the stove and wrapped around his chest, a poultice of heat to fight the deep-seated chill. The decision was made in an instant. Modesty was a luxury she could not afford when his life was at stake. She turned her back to him, her fingers fumbling for the laces of her dress. The room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She unbuttoned the dress and let it fall, pooling at her feet. She stood in her chemise and corset, her shoulders exposed to the cool air. Her hands went to the corset laces at her back, but her fingers were clumsy, shaking with a mixture of fear and a sudden, disorienting self-consciousness. The knot was stubborn, pulled tight from her hurried dressing that morning. A low voice came from the cot behind her. "Eliza." She froze. He was watching her. "Turn back to the fire," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I need more bandages." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the hiss of the stove and the howl of the wind. She heard him shifting on the cot, the rustle of the blankets. "Your hands are shaking," he said, his voice raspy with fever. "You will not get it undone, and let me—" Her breath caught in her throat. The idea was scandalous, unthinkable, but the sight of him shivering, pale and vulnerable on the cot, overrode every lesson in propriety she had ever learned. She hesitated for a long second, then gave a single, small nod. He moved slowly, swinging his legs off the cot. He stood behind her, careful not to touch her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the feverish warmth a stark contrast to the room's chill. She stared into the fire, her face burning, watching the play of their shadows on the rough wooden wall. She felt his fingers, surprisingly gentle for a man of his size and strength, working at the stubborn knot. He was methodical, patient, his knuckles brushing the thin fabric of her chemise but never her skin. The laces loosened. He pulled the strings free from their eyelets, his movements economical and precise. The corset fell away, and she could breathe, a deep, shuddering gasp of air. She stood for a moment, wrapped in a profound and terrifying intimacy, her back to him, clad only in her thin chemise. The air on her skin felt electric. A strange, broken sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped her lips. The cowboy undid her corset by candlelight. She whispered to the fire, the words tumbling out, a startling, unbidden confession of the moment's sheer absurdity and gravity. The Virgin gasped. "You had better marry me after this." The silence that followed was absolute. She thought she had broken something, some unspoken rule that had governed their quiet interactions. She had named the thing that hung between them, and now it would shatter. Then, from behind her, came a low chuckle. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. He was laughing. The tension in her shoulders released in a rush. She turned to face him, pulling her fallen dress up to cover herself. He was smiling, a faint, weary smile that transformed his grim face. The candlelight softened the hard lines, and in his eyes, she saw not shock, but a deep, gentle understanding. They both started to laugh then, a quiet, shared laughter that was more precious than any words. It was a release, a small, warm rebellion against the cold, the violence, and the fear that surrounded them. When the laughter subsided, her smile faded, and she looked at him, her expression serious. "I was not jesting, Jonah, not entirely. If that day ever comes, it will be because of love and honor, not because of this, not because anyone forced our hand." He held her gaze, his own expression turning solemn. The fever and the pain were still there, but beneath them was a clear, unwavering certainty. "That day," he said, his voice low and firm, a vow spoken in the heart of the storm. "I will kneel." She took the discarded corset and tore the soft lining from it. After warming the thick strips of flannel by the stove, she returned to his side. She gently wrapped the warm cloth around his torso, her fingers brushing against his hot skin. The shivering had begun to subside, his body surrendering to the steady, penetrating warmth. He lay back down, his breathing still shallow but more even. She pulled the single chair in the room close to the cot and sat, too exhausted to move, too worried to sleep. After a long silence, his hand found hers in the dim light. His grip was weak, but it was there. She held on, her small hand enveloped in his. The storm howled its lonely song outside, but in the small, candlelit room, two solitary people, stripped of their armor, found a fragile, unspoken peace, leaning her head against the edge of his cot, her hand holding his. Eliza Hart finally closed her eyes and slept. The world was reborn in water. The great silence of the snow gave way to the gentle music of its melting, 1,000 tiny rivulets carving clean paths through the red mud. The sun returned, a pale but welcome stranger in the sky, and with its warmth came a fragile sense of hope. The siege was over. San Perdido was no longer an island. Jonah's fever broke with the dawn of the second day. He was weak, but the clear, steady light was back in his eyes. He sat propped up on the narrow cot, watching as Eliza directed the beginnings of a cleanup. Her voice calm and sure. The people of the town, the same ones who had whispered about her weeks ago, now worked alongside her, clearing debris from the ruined barn, their movements imbued with a new, shared purpose. They were not just rebuilding a school, they were reclaiming their town. Deputy May Collins arrived on the third day, her horse kicking up fans of muddy water. She was not alone. Behind her rode a territorial marshal, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen everything. He carried a rifle in his saddle scabbard and an air of absolute authority. May dismounted and walked directly to Eliza, a folded document in her hand. "It is a federal warrant," May said, her voice crisp and official, but her eyes were warm, for Silas Crow, on charges of unlawful appropriation of water resources, bribery of public officials, and mail fraud related to his supply contracts. The ledger you found gave us everything we needed to convince a judge. Eliza took the document, the crisp paper a tangible symbol of a victory she had almost given up on. She looked over at Jonah, who gave her a slow, tired smile. It was not over, but the law, the great, slow-moving machinery of justice, had finally arrived in San Perdido. Before she rode off with the marshal to serve the warrant, May pulled Eliza aside, out of earshot of the others. She held out a second letter, this one thinner, the envelope postmarked from Boston. "This came for me on the morning supply wagon," May said quietly, "from an associate of mine back east. I had asked him to look into your history, to find the source of the rumors. He found more than I expected." Eliza's heart went cold. The past, the one thing she had ridden 1,000 miles to escape, had found her. May's expression was gentle. "It is not what you think. The young man, the one who accused you, his name is William Bancroft III. His father's shipping empire is under federal investigation for embezzlement. It seems young William, in a panic, wrote a letter to his sister. He confessed everything. He admitted he was the one who pursued you, that when you rejected him, he lied to his father to cover his own foolishness. He sacrificed your name to save his own skin." Eliza stood perfectly still, the world tilting slightly on its axis. The shame she had carried for so long, the heavy cloak of a reputation she did not deserve, simply evaporated under the pale desert sun. It was gone. She was free. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "Thank you, May," she whispered, the words barely audible. The deputy simply nodded, a deep and abiding respect in her eyes. "The truth has a way of finding the light, Eliza. Sometimes it just takes a while." The news of the federal warrant spread through San Perdido like a grass fire. It was a tremor that shook the foundations of Crow's power. But a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. Crow, seeing his empire of fear and corruption about to crumble, decided on one last, desperate gambit. He would not be taken down by a woman he considered his inferior. He would destroy her reputation so completely that the town would turn on her. Warrant or no warrant, he still held the lies from Boston, and he would use them as his final weapon. He gathered the dozen or so men still loyal to him, men whose own petty corruptions were tied to his, and they rode from his ranch, a small, grim army moving through the mud. They were not heading for the marshal's office to surrender. They were heading for the school. The confrontation came as the afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the purple mountains. The air was clean and cool. A sense of weary peace had settled over the people working at the well. They were sorting through the salvageable timbers when the riders appeared, their horses splashing through the puddles, their faces set in hard, angry lines. Crow was at their head, his face flushed with rage. "This property is a public health menace," he bellowed, his voice booming across the clearing. "It is a squatter's camp, a breeding ground for filth and disease, by order of the San Perdido Health Committee. I am seizing this land and everything on it for immediate sanitation." It was a flimsy, transparent lie, and no one believed it. This was not about hygiene. It was a raw, naked power play. He was making his stand on the very ground he had tried to steal. For a long moment, no one moved. The homesteaders and townspeople stood frozen, their shovels and hammers hanging loosely in their hands. They were not fighters. They looked at Crow's men, at the pistols holstered on their hips, and fear, old and familiar, began to creep back in. Then, a single figure moved, Mrs. Ortega, her back as straight as a yucca stalk, walked forward and stood directly in front of Crow's horse. She did not speak. She simply stood, a small, indomitable woman of 80 years, and planted herself in the path of tyranny. Her courage was a spark. Another woman, the storekeeper's wife, left her work and came to stand beside Mrs. Ortega, then another, and another. Soon, all the women of San Perdido, migrant and town dweller alike, had formed a silent human barricade between Crow and the well. They held no weapons. Their strength was in their presence, their shared, unyielding defiance. Eliza moved to join them, but Jonah's hand on her arm stopped her. He had gotten to his feet, his face pale but his eyes clear. "Not yet," he said, his voice a low command. "This is their fight now." Crow stared at the line of women, his face contorted with disbelief and fury. He was being defied by the very people he had always considered invisible. "Move!" he snarled. No one moved. Then a new sound began, soft at first, then growing in volume. It came from behind the line of women. The children, her students, were standing together, led by young Thomas. They began to speak. "My name is Tomas," the boy said, his voice high and clear. "My name is Maria," a little girl beside him piped up. "My name is Samuel. My name is Anna." One after another, they spoke their names into the tense silence. It was a litany of identity, a declaration of their own worth. They were not the anonymous poor. They were not a health menace. They were children with names, with a future, and they were claiming it. The chorus grew, a beautiful, heartbreaking act of defiance. Crow's face turned a shade of purple. This was an intolerable humiliation. He turned to one of his men, a brutish man with a cruel mouth. "Fire a shot. Scare them out of the way." The man drew his pistol, a smirk on his face. He did not aim at the crowd, but into the air. The crack of the gunshot was a violent slash across the peaceful afternoon. The bullet screamed upwards, and then there was a second sound, a loud, metallic clang. The shot had ricocheted. By a 1 in a million chance, the lead slug had struck the lip of the heavy, bronze school bell where it lay on its side near the foundation. A single, pure, resonant note rang out. It was not the frantic, desperate alarm Eliza had rung in the heart of the storm. This was a different sound. It was clear, commanding, and righteous. It rolled across the muddy clearing, over the heads of the silent women and the chanting children, over the shocked faces of Crow and his men. It was the sound of a community finding its voice, the sound of truth rising from the ice, the sound of a bell that could no longer be silenced. In the ringing silence that followed, Everyone knew that the fight for San Perdido had just been won. The trial of Silas Crow was not held in a courthouse. San Perdido did not have one. Instead, it was convened in the open, in the muddy plaza between the general store and the chapel. Under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, the air was heavy, charged with the promise of the season's first real rain. The entire town had gathered, a silent, sober audience ringing the makeshift court. The territorial marshal, a man named Elias Vance, presided. His bench a sturdy table dragged from the saloon. His face was like carved rock, impartial and unyielding. Silas Crow sat beside his lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man brought in from Santa Fe who looked profoundly out of place in the muddy town. Crow was a caged bear, his usual blustering confidence replaced by a sullen, simmering rage. He stared at the townspeople, his eyes promising retribution, but the fear he had once commanded was gone, replaced by a cold, unified contempt. Deputy May Collins acted as the prosecution. She stood tall and composed, presenting her case with the methodical precision of a surgeon. She began with the ledger, the one Thomas had found. She read from its pages, her clear voice ringing through the quiet plaza, detailing years of bribes to councilmen, fraudulent supply orders, and illegal land seizures. With each entry she read, another nail was hammered into the coffin of Crow's reputation. The men on the town committee, who had once been his puppets, now refused to meet his gaze, their faces pale with shame and fear. Next, May called upon Mrs. Ortega. The old woman walked slowly to the table, her back straight, her dignity a silent rebuke to the man on trial. She did not speak of laws or deeds. She spoke of history. She told the story of the well, of the first families who had dug it with their bare hands, of the children born and the fevers cooled by its water. She spoke of Samuel Hart and his dream of a school. Her testimony was a living history, transforming a patch of dirt and a hole in the ground into the sacred heart of the community. The well was not a resource to be owned. It was an inheritance to be shared. Then it was Eliza's turn. She presented the letters from her uncle, the family Bible, and the original deed, laying them out for the marshal to inspect. She told her story simply, without embellishment, her voice steady. She was Samuel Hart's niece, the rightful heir to the land. She was not a squatter. She was family. When she was finished, Crow's lawyer rose, a condescending smile on his lips. He did not challenge the documents. He attacked the woman. An heir, he said, his voice dripping with theatrical pity. A long-lost heir who appears at the most convenient of moments, a woman who travels alone, a woman with a storied past. He let the words hang in the heavy air. Tell me, Miss Hart, what was the nature of your departure from Boston? Was it not under a cloud of scandal, a scandal involving a prominent young man? Eliza felt the familiar, hot sting of shame, but she met his gaze without flinching. I was a teacher there, as I am here. A false accusation was made against me. A false accusation, the lawyer mused. How convenient. Just as these papers are convenient. Just as your sudden friendship with the taciturn Mr. Pike is convenient. He has been a frequent visitor, has he not? He has protected you, worked for you. What services? One wonders. Have you provided him in return for such loyalty? The crowd murmured, the ugly poison of innuendo seeping into the proceedings. This was Crow's true defense, not to prove his innocence, but to destroy Eliza's character, to paint her as a manipulative adventuress, undeserving of their trust or the law's protection. Before Eliza could answer, a figure moved from the edge of the crowd. Jonah Pike, his side bandaged, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence commanded attention. He addressed the marshal, but his eyes were on the people of San Perdido. You want to know who Miss Hart is, he said, his voice low and clear. I will tell you. She is the woman who faced down armed men to get to this town. She is the woman who knelt in the dirt to tend to a sick child when no one else would. She is the one who fed your children from her own pocket when they were hungry. She stood her ground when this man, he pointed a steady finger at Crow, blew up her school. and she stitched my shoulder by candlelight when I was injured protecting one of her students. She did not run when his men came to poison the well that belongs to all of you. She stood and rang a bell and called you to stand with her." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent faces. "You can listen to the paid whispers of a rich man's lawyer, or you can look at what she has done. Judge her by her actions, judge her by the contents of her heart, not by the rumors that cowards hide behind." He said nothing more. He stepped back into the crowd, his statement lingering in the air, a powerful testament that no lawyer's trickery could erase. The lawyer, momentarily flustered, tried to recover. Actions. Yes, the actions of a woman who cleverly cultivates an image. But we have no proof of these alleged crimes. The attempted poisoning, for instance. Where is the evidence? A sack of spilled powder in the snow. It could have been anything. Flour. Salt. It was this, a small, clear voice said. All heads turned. Young Tomas, holding his mother's hand, was standing at the edge of the plaza. His other hand was held out, and in it was a small glass vial, stoppered with a cork. It was filled with a familiar white powder. "I found it," he said, his voice trembling but determined. After the men ran, it fell from the bag. He walked forward and placed the vial on the marshal's table. Marshal Vance picked it up, examining it closely. There was a small paper label pasted to the glass. He read the words aloud. "Crow Consolidated Salt Works, property of Silas Crow." Crow's face went white. His lawyer began to sputter, but the marshal held up a hand for silence. He called forward an old man who had worked at the salt mine for 20 years before being fired for complaining about safety conditions. The man, a salt expert by trade, uncorked the vial and cautiously sniffed the contents. He dabbed a tiny amount on his finger, tasted it, and immediately spit. "That is not salt," he declared, his voice ringing with certainty. "That is industrial bleach. We used it for scouring the mining equipment. A spoonful of that in a well would poison the water for a year. It would sicken a whole town. It would kill a child." The final piece had clicked into place. The final lie was exposed. A low, angry growl rose from the crowd. Crow was no longer just a bully and a thief. He was a man who would have poisoned their children to get what he wanted. Marshal Vance stood up, his face grim. "Silas Crow," he said, his voice the final judgment. "This court finds you guilty. Your properties, including the salt mine, are hereby seized by the authority of the United States territory of New Mexico, the land known as the Old Schoolhouse, and the well upon it is the rightful property of the Hart family." As he spoke the final words, the sky broke. A fat, heavy drop of rain splashed onto the dusty table, then another, and another. A steady, cleansing rain began to fall, pattering on the hats and shoulders of the crowd, turning the dust to dark, rich mud. It was as if the very heavens were washing the town clean. The marshal nodded to May. She walked to Silas Crow and produced a pair of iron handcuffs. As she clicked them shut around his wrists, the rain began to fall harder, plastering his fine coat to his body, washing the dust and arrogance from his face, leaving only a pale, defeated man. The reign of Silas Crow was over. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, excited voices, their faces turned up to the welcome rain. A new era had begun for San Perdido. Eliza stood beside the well, the rain cool on her face, feeling the weight of years of struggle and shame wash away. She had her name back. She had her home. When she looked up, Jonah was standing in front of her. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat, tracing paths down his lean cheeks. He was not smiling. His expression was serious, almost solemn. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes full of a quiet, profound emotion. Then, in the middle of the muddy plaza, as the sweet, clean rain of a new season fell around them, Jonah Pike slowly went down on one knee. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring of hammered silver. He held it out to her. Engraved on its surface was a delicate, intricate image of the old stone well. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "If you want, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the sound of the rain, not because of a rumor, not because of a promise made in a fever, just because of us. The silver ring was cold from the rain, but her hand was warm as she reached out to touch his. He knelt before her in the mud, a cowboy in a downpour, his proposal as quiet and true as the landscape around them, through the curtain of falling water. Eliza looked into the steady gray eyes of Jonah Pike, and she saw her future. She saw a home. She saw a love that was not a cage of possession, but a shelter built of respect and shared strength. She nodded, a single, certain movement. Yes, she said, her voice a whisper that the rain could not wash away. Yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The engraved well, the source of so much strife, was now a symbol of their beginning. He rose to his feet, and in the middle of the cleansed and listening town, he drew her into his arms. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of profound, peaceful homecoming. The rebuilding of San Perdido began the next day. It was not a formal process, but a natural, organic coming together. The energy that had been spent on fear and suspicion was now channeled into creation. Jonah, his side healing cleanly, led the work on the old barn. He was not a man who gave loud orders, but a man who simply began a task, and others, seeing the rightness of his actions, would join in. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, a rhythm of renewal. Timbers were salvaged, new adobe bricks were made from the mud of the recent rains, and slowly, a new structure rose from the ruins of the old. It was not just a schoolhouse anymore. The town, in a formal meeting led by May Collins, voted to name it the San Perdido School and Health House. One large room was dedicated to the classroom, its new windows letting in the bright, clear light of the desert. A smaller, adjacent room became an infirmary, stocked with clean linens and basic medical supplies that Eliza purchased with funds from the sale of Crow's seized assets. And at its heart, the old well, now protected by a new stone housing and a sturdy roof, was designated a community resource, its water to be shared freely and fairly among all residents. The management of this new institution was placed in the hands of a community trust, co-administered by Eliza Hart and May Collins. Eliza's vision for the school expanded beyond reading and arithmetic. She saw the needs of the women, the silent carriers of the community's health and well-being. She started a class in midwifery and basic nursing. She did not position herself as the sole expert. Instead, she invited the older women, including several mothers from the Mescalero families, to act as assistants and to share their own traditional knowledge of healing and childbirth. In the small, clean infirmary, women who had once been separated by culture and language now worked together, learning from one another, their shared purpose as healers forging a bond stronger than any prejudice. May, in her new, official role as the head of town security, would often stop by, a quiet observer of the profound and peaceful revolution taking place. San Perdido was not just rebuilding its structures, it was mending its soul. The drought did not vanish with the first rain. The land was still thirsty, the memory of scarcity still fresh. The deep, steady supply from the old well was a blessing, a lifeline that prevented the return of the desperate conflicts of the past. But the surrounding landscape remained tinder dry. The shadow of potential tragedy still lingered. It came on a hot, windy afternoon in late autumn. A plume of smoke, thin and gray at first, appeared on the northern horizon. A lightning strike in a dry patch of forest. The wind, a hot, dry breath, fanned the spark into a flame, and the flame into a hungry, advancing fire. Fear, a familiar, metallic taste, returned to the mouths of the people. In the past, such a threat would have sent them scattering, each family looking only to its own survival. But this was a new San Perdido. May Collins took command, her voice sharp and clear, a rallying point in the rising panic. She organized the men into fire lines, sending them out with wet sacks and shovels to create a fire break. Jonah, his strength fully returned, led the bucket brigade. A line of men, women, and older children stretched from the well to the edge of town, passing heavy buckets of water from hand to hand with a steady, determined rhythm. The water that had been a source of division was now their shared shield. Eliza, with her nursing students, set up a first aid station near the chapel, ready with clean water and bandages for the smoke-filled eyes and minor burns of the firefighters. They fought the fire for a full day and a long, terrifying night, a small, determined army battling a monster of heat and smoke. The orange glow painted the sky, a false and terrible dawn. They worked until their muscles screamed and their lungs burned, driven by the knowledge that they were not just saving their individual homes, but their collective future. By morning, the wind shifted. A blessed, gentle breeze from the south began to push the fire back upon itself, away from the town. The immediate danger was over. They had held the line, exhausted, soot-stained, and smelling of smoke. The people of San Perdido gathered in the plaza as the real sun rose. They looked at each other, and in the weary faces of their neighbors, they saw not strangers, but comrades. They had faced the fire together, and they had not broken. They had become a community. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the golden light of a late afternoon under the broad, sheltering branches of an old cottonwood tree by the arroyo. The whole town was there, their faces clean, their clothes their Sunday best. Eliza wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair adorned with a few late-blooming desert wildflowers. Jonah stood beside her, his usual worn denim replaced by a clean shirt and a dark coat, his quiet solidity a comfort and a promise. Reverend Michael officiated, but they spoke their own vows. Eliza went first, her voice clear and sure, her eyes locked on Jonah. She held his hand, the silver ring a cool, solid presence on her finger. "My name is my own to claim," she said. "Our home is ours to build." When it was his turn, Jonah looked at her, and the love in his eyes was as vast and deep as the desert sky. "Water flows on," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "but love stays." A few weeks later, a new wooden sign was hung above the stone arch of the well. Jonah had carved the letters himself, deep and true. It did not bear a name or a proclamation of ownership. It was an invitation. "Whoever is thirsty, come and drink. Whoever is afraid, come and learn courage." The days settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and hard, satisfying work. The school was full, the infirmary was a place of healing, and the well gave its water freely. The scars on the land from the fire were already beginning to fade, covered by the first shoots of new green. One evening, as Eliza and Jonah sat on the porch of the small house they had begun to build, a rider came into town with news. The railroad was planning to build a new spur line, one that would pass just a few miles south of San Perdido. The world was coming. With it would come new people, new challenges, new opportunities, and new troubles. The town's isolation was ending, but San Perdido was ready. It had a name, it had laws, and now, finally, it had a heart. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.